just
Welcome,
finished the
everyone.
BLG. Right.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Hale. I'm a professor here, a fellow at Stanford, and a professor in the Blavatnik School of Government, and I'm helping to chair this year's Visiting Parliamentary Fellow Series, of which this event tonight is another installation. And I'm delighted to be joined again by our Visiting Parliamentary Fellows for this year, one of whom is here at the moment, Chris Skidmore, the other of whom is hurtling his way through time and space on a train coming from a boat in London, so he'll be joining us momentarily. So, a dramatic entrance awaits you. Our topic tonight is on land. How do we use land? How does land get used? How do we achieve what we need to achieve through the actual physical reality of the space on which we live? And the map above you on the screen is showing you two images that speaks to why this topic of land is so important. On the left, you see the current distribution of land use in the UK from a government report from 2021. And if you, there in the back here, you can't see, but the big green parts are really around sort of the beef and lamb pastures. And if you look at, it's effectively Wales, the part on the left side there, that's the built-up environment, the dark area. On the right side is a map showing you what the UK Climate Change Committee said could be a potential scenario for land use in 2050 if the UK were to meet its climate targets. And that's one scenario, of course, there could be others, but I think what's interesting is how different those two maps are in terms of what is getting used for what. How much is getting used for energy, how much is getting used for food, how much is getting used for nature, how much is getting used for housing, how much is getting used for other kinds of infrastructure, how much is being restored to its natural state. These are all really big changes potentially. So if you think about all the topics we've thought about in the seminar series so far, transportation, building, some of the political dynamics that have been motivating them, actually physical space is really at the heart of many of those debates, and I'm really excited to have a discussion today about a green and pleasant land, how to make the most of it for the way forward. I'm joined by a fantastic panel who I'll momentarily introduce very briefly, but you have their full bios on the website. Our format will again be fairly conversational, interactive. We'll have a sort of rapid series of questions. I'll ask for our speakers to give us maybe 2 or 3 minute answers to keep the conversation flowing. I'll be looking to all of us in the audience to keep your questions coming in as well, so looking forward to those contributions. And to remind you, this is being broadcast online and also will be recorded, so whatever you say will be captured on the internet for all time. So think about that. But let me just go quickly through our speakers. I've already mentioned Chris Skidmore, who is MP and also the climate change lead, who needs an introduction on this topic. To his left is Minette Batters, who is a farmer, who has also been the former president of the National Farmers Union, and she's the first woman to hold that position in the organization's 130-year history. Welcome, Minette. To her left is, so I'm going to get your full bio, Andy. Andy Egan is the head of conservation policy at the Woodland Trust and director of fellowship of the Trees CIC. And his work has been focused on really how to ensure that nature and tree stewardship is at the heart of what we do. To his left sits Mr. Mark Owen Lloyd, who is director of the Botley West Solar Farm Project, proposed in West Oxfordshire. And he has a background in energy trading and in finance. And to his left sits Mr. Neil Kenward, who is Director of Strategy, Economics, Research, and Net Zero, which has the catchy acronym CERN at Ofgem, the grid regulator. And before that, Neil spent time as the head of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Treasury. So welcome, Neil. It's a great panel. We want to get right to the conversation. So I'm going to launch right in with a set of questions on what do we need to achieve? We have this limited physical space. We have all of these competing goals. What's the important priority from different perspectives? And Chris, I wonder if I could start with you to say, from a climate perspective, which is actually the motivating theme of our seminar series this year, what is needed?
So thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for attending tonight. I think for myself, I had the opportunity of leading a net zero review for the UK government back in 2022, early 2023. And we sort of set out 10 key missions that needed to be achieved in the longer term, let alone some of the sort of short-term policy recommendations we made. And one of those missions was for a net zero nature mission. Too often you see the needs of agriculture and nature being sort of polarized against the sort of technocratic delivery of infrastructure needed for net zero. We've seen that debate sort of play out in the media and in the sort of sometimes confrontational issues around planning for solar farms versus agricultural land use. And we've seen the Secretary of State make a recent announcement only last week on this issue. I was keen to try to depoliticize and as a result potentially de-risk the transition when it came to land use. We know that 40% of delivering net zero requires looking at land use in some form, whether that's through emissions through sort of food use, or whether that's through also sort of future land use around housing, or indeed the adoption of new renewable technologies that will be using land. So one of the things we don't have at the moment is the data and the infrastructure to be able to make some of the decisions we need to make. I mean, pretty much, you know, the graph you see behind us is obviously sort of a modelling estimate from the CCC, but it also, you know, recognises the very imperfect sort of science that is being used to deliver this data. And I was very keen that we should really start with first principles of having a land use strategy that would identify potentially some of the research that sort of suggests that that space you see, I think, for golf courses up there, 3% of all land is probably the same amount of land that is needed to deliver the 70 gigawatts of solar power. One of the recommendations that I put forward in the net zero review. You know, what we don't have on here also is looking at onshore wind, another huge sort of X question, particularly for the UK in comparison to other countries. Every country seems to have its own sort of bête noire of the energy sort of transition. In some countries it's nuclear, but the nuclear industry in this country will say, well, actually, you know, when it comes to land use, we need a tiny amount of land to deliver a nuclear power plant. Whereas obviously looking at onshore wind, yeah, has been a challenge for certain politicians, particularly from my own former party, about how to identify sites for the future. I suggested 30 gigawatts by 2030, 35 by 2035. So we need quite urgently to have a roadmap, which is going to not just identify sites, but also, you know, somehow demystify what might need to happen for the transition. Now, I'm also a big believer in that the energy transition can't be forced upon local communities. It's not going to succeed unless we deliver sort of consent. And how do we build consent, particularly in agricultural communities, is one of the big challenges that we're going to be discussing tonight. And for myself, it again comes down to how do we provide the opportunities at a farm level to help farmers recognise that potentially, again, there isn't specifically attention in potentially some of the food for the future that they're going to generate, but potentially low carbon alternatives potentially have huge export value, that we can look to create new economies within our food industry. And I personally sort of felt when I took the net zero review forward, some people sort of said, well, look, you haven't really grappled with this issue of food, particularly around beef and dairy. And I was very conscious about this, if I'm honest with you, because I'd seen certain climate reports in the past be totally junked and put to one side because they sort of overreached themselves. And this sort of issue around meat, we have seen, obviously, you know, even in the government now, sort of talking about these sort of mythical meat taxes that are somehow being created by the CCC. I didn't want to get into that culture war. I think that's the risk we also need to face here, is how do you create a staged and an appropriate transition that's going to recognise we've got to create informed choices for people. Already, you know, just to give one example, we've seen the sort of consumption of sausages plummet in the past sort of 10 years. You know, people are already deciding to make decisions about what they want to eat for the future, and certain generations are coming up and now making decisions around, you know, what they want to eat regards the carbon intensity of the product. There is obviously a huge challenge around recognising what is a low carbon food, that sometimes some food from far away is low carbon in comparison to local food. It's not always the case that what is locally grown is going to somehow be low carbon, unless we can sort of complete that circle and really sort of challenge that narrative and create low carbon local food for the future. So I think there is also an international dimension around exports and imports, but potentially, you know, by creating the right data infrastructure, by creating the right accountability mechanisms, we can deliver. It's not there at the moment. And one of the recommendations in the net zero review was to have a, you know, a low carbon food labelling scheme, not to necessarily impose upon communities those producing the food, but to give people that ability to choose themselves, to make those informed choices. So I would, I'm not denigrating the fact that land use is absolutely huge. The CCC said it was particularly pertinent from the late 2030s, early 2040s onwards, that now has to make some key decisions. But we can do a lot now to prepare local communities and populations for potentially what they may decide to do anyway, if we give them the choices to do that.
Fantastic, thanks, Chris. Why don't you pass the microphone just to your left to Minette? And Minette, Chris laid out some of the themes I think are fascinating, but if you look at the map above you, most of it is farmers, right? This is agricultural land that we're talking about. So what is the priority for the food system and for the people who work in it?
Yeah, while Chris is talking, I'm really thinking, how on earth do I sum this up in a short amount of time? And I can't. But look, I think this is an exciting time for farming and for food production, because where we start this journey from is a very good place. So 98.5% of households in the country, bearing in mind we're a population headed towards 70 million, have milk in their fridge. So we need to be self-sufficient in milk. And if we look at the efficiency of a UK dairy cow compared to the global average, you've got, broad terms, 270 million dairy cows. And we'd only need 70 million if they were as efficient as a UK dairy cow. And what we want to be really careful of on this journey is that we can produce nothing and emit nothing. And we probably have one of the best climates in the world for producing food here. We are facing so many challenges, not just the geopolitical situation, but water security is becoming a massive issue. And so we're in a good place to be producing food here, and we're producing it efficiently already. So what we're good at producing here, we want to keep producing what we're good at. I think there are dangers around linking production with consumption, because why would we be denying other parts of the world that don't have the luxury of the climate that we have from buying high quality British produced food? So when actually Michael Gove, I've worked with so many prime ministers over the last 6 years, 4 actually, but when Michael Gove was in office and we'd left the European Union and the talks for a green Brexit, we actually said we could beat the government target by 10 years and hit net zero by 2040 with the right policies and the right incentives in place. And that is absolutely critical, because we do start this journey from a good place. But we effectively focused on 3 buckets. One was definitely focusing on the bioeconomy and renewable energy. 2 was nature-based solutions, more trees, more hedges. And 3, and the exciting one, I think, was really focusing on efficiencies. How do we produce the same amount of food or more food off less land with less inputs? How do we wean farmers off of synthetic fertilizers and inputs, nitrogen fertilizer being the key one? And there's definitely the ability to do that, to lead the journey onto green manures, resource use efficiency. We waste more food in this country than any other country in Europe. If we sorted that out alone, we'd be a long way down the road. But how we focus on resource use efficiency, taking those phosphates and those nitrates out of our watercourses, out of our dairy sector, drying them, pelletizing them so we can use them in places away from the watercourse. But this is a huge, huge subject, of which I feel farmers are the solution. We can't do it any other way. And as I say, we can produce nothing and emit nothing. But the real danger, if we downsize production at the moment, which to a certain extent all 4 prime ministers were fairly focused on, that we produce a lot less here, there is a danger that this is legislated. We are the only country in the world that has legislated on this, that in 25 years' time, if we don't keep production levels up, we are actually consuming food with a higher emissions footprint in 25 years' time. And what we want to see is a UK production system that is net zero. But you've got to take everybody on that journey with you. So this is a big question for Europe and getting the accounting framework right, but a massive question globally for how we do this. And my closing comment would be, we are facing a crisis with everything, quite honestly. That climate change is challenging on the biodiversity crisis, the crisis for nature, the crisis for making sure food security is important. And we must have a balanced approach whereby we are achieving on all of those, not just one of them. That is the key thing. And I think, farmland has a lot to offer on renewable energy. We're not using our buildings. We're not making any good use of anaerobic digestion. We could be really turbocharging a new approach to a localized energy system if our national grid could cope with it. But I'd love to go on, but I can tell that
fantastic. We'll come to the grid in a moment. But I'd love, and I'm also going to follow up with you on what that package was that would have enabled the 10-year earlier target. I'd be fascinated to come back to on that. But first, Andy, tell us about nature. Obviously, we don't have any of these things without a thriving natural world as well. So how does that get figured in?
Yeah, well, as I'm speaking for nature, I thought I would start with a reminder that we ourselves actually part of nature. We often forget that. The problem is that most of humanity has chosen an extractive and often destructive relationship with the rest of nature. So I'd like to take inspiration from Faith in Nature, which is a company that's actually given nature a seat on its board. And I think if in many institutions and companies we actually did that, we would actually sort of less listen to what the rest of nature might say about the decisions we were making. And often we don't realise that the oldest living beings in Britain are our ancient yew trees. Some are 5,000 years old. And unlike the lovely constructions that we make, they have no legal protection. So occasionally they may have something called a tree preservation order, but often these seem to vanish when someone else decides that something else should be placed where the yew tree actually lives. So when we look at things like the state of our nature, and tree cover, for example, is only 14% in England, and that compares to an average of around 37% across the rest of Europe. And interestingly, tree cover levels in our urban and our rural areas, in our urban areas, in our towns and cities, are the same as in our rural areas, which is something a bit surprising. So I would argue that our land isn't quite as green and pleasant as it should be. And when we look at our urban tree cover, even that isn't equally distributed. And that's why the Woodland Trust has brought the Tree Equity Score to the UK. So investment can be targeted at improving tree cover in those areas with less and where it's needed most. And also when you look at the state of the woods that we have left, only 9% of our native woods are in good ecological condition. And species abundance in this country has declined by more than a third since 1970, and 13% are threatened with extinction. So it's no exaggeration to say our nature's in crisis, and it's every bit as serious as a climate crisis. And the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We're as low as 228th out of 240 countries for biodiversity and TACnists. And one of those contributors is intensive farming, yet biodiversity loss and climate change are themselves the biggest threat to our food production, as the government's own food safety report in 2021 highlighted. But with the Environment Act 2021, we do for the first time have legal targets for halting the decline in species abundance by 2030. But the Office for Environmental Protection has warned that the current government environmental improvement plan to deliver on these is inadequate. One of the pillars of the plan are local nature recovery strategies, but the intended funding pipeline for those through the Environmental Land Management Scheme has been severed. Now, I could list a long list of policies that nature needs, and just so a lot of them are featured in our series of nature recovery reports, Trees and Woods, Heart of Nature Recovery. And we produced one for each of the UK nations. So we can come to some of those later if you like. But to be honest, I think that for me, the most important thing is that we have a shared intention of and commitment to repairing our relationship with nature, and that we focus on the outcomes we would like to see for nature, climate, and people. And I think they can be aligned and fit together. So in terms of nature, the situation may seem bleak, and to be honest, it is. But I think if we think more in kind of nature time, tree time, and learn from some of the great tree survivors that have been here for 5,000 years, you know, we can shape a pathway for future generations to experience an abundant and a thriving, green and pleasant land for all.
Thank you, Andy. I think you know, you're quite right to shine the spotlight on the huge crisis we find ourselves in, but also maybe some of the seeds of hope, which is where we want to ultimately get to. Let's complement our picture by turning from climate to food to nature to energy. And Mark and Neil, you're going to help us think about both the making of energy and then how energy gets around. But Mark, you're trying to build energy systems. What is needed from your perspective?
That is a very good question. Well, what's quite interesting is that there's a large amount in place in the United Kingdom to enable people like myself and other renewable developers to do what they need to do. One of the reasons that my company is here in Oxfordshire and other projects is because of the 2008 Planning Act, which was passed as a result of the 15-year time it took to build Terminal 5 at Heathrow. A public inquiry that went on for so long, the local villagers sent it a birthday cake. So they passed the 2008 Planning Act, which set out the development consent order regime, which sets out a timetable for certain things that developers have to do to develop its seriously large and important infrastructure. And what we're trying to do here in West Oxfordshire, we could not do in France or Germany or Spain. They don't have the large infrastructure planning regime. So what it gives is everyone certainty. We don't know we're going to get consent, but we know how long it'll take. We know what it'll cost. And at the end of it, although recent Seneca and Mallard Pass delays have shown that it can be politically interfered with, but at the end of it, you should get a decision. So local communities and the developer will know on a certain date if it's a yes or a no, which you think the blight that can be brought from a major infrastructure project hanging over a community. It's not just bad for the developer, it's terrible for local communities who are not sure whether it's going to happen or not. So that is in place. Chris alluded to the political interference. We need to make sure that that is kept. It's kept out. In an election year, that's probably impossible, but normally it is not. But in terms of, and we'll presumably come on to the grid and other infrastructure issues, but in terms of the regulatory environment, it's there. And the UK has done a very interesting thing, which is decide to go for net zero, to reduce our generation via fossil fuels to 2% by 2035, and we've actually gone and closed our generation. So we preempted what we're doing, and we've closed all our coal stations, bar Radcliffe, which closed in a few months' time. But basically, we're not generating coal, and we try not to use gas. What we haven't done is construct the replacements for that. We've got some wind and we've got some solar, but what we need is a national debate. Chris alluded to in his report last year, we need government education so that people understand what is happening to our energy system. I've stood in 20 village halls in the last 18 months and spoken to locals responding to our proposals. And a lot of them do not know how their electricity arrives in their home. Many think that we have 8 nuclear power stations and will continue to do so. When you say they're all going to close, there is surprise. So I think education and information is very important. And at a basic level, remove the emotion. I know it's very hard when a developer turns up and says, I want to put 2 million panels on 3,000 acres. But what we need to do is think, what does this mean for the country. What do I get from this? And education obviously will remove that emotion. But one, I mean, I suppose as a final thing, what there is with with renewables is there is an opportunity to do things alongside it. Many of the things that you referred to, the destruction of biodiversity and the loss of habitat, that is in many ways caused by, one of the causes is intensive farming. Now, our site, 3,500 acres, will have no intensive farming on it for 42 years. And our landlords, one of the reasons they're doing it, as well as the income from the solar farm, is the resting of their land for 42 years. Blenheim will be handed back to their farm in much better condition, with much improved soil at the end of that 42 years. So what we need to try and look is that everything has good and bad, and try and see why it's being done. And on a very basic level, we need some kind of government body that oversees the implementation of that, so that people can be seen to understand what is happening, and doesn't fall. Minette mentioned the number of prime ministers. I sat next to a housing developer the other day at a meeting with the Labour Party, who said he'd had 12 housing ministers in 14 months. So we need to go above that. But I think the basic story is people need to look at what is happening, try and understand. We're changing our energy system in a larger way than we ever have probably since the 1950s.
It's really an interesting set of issues. I'm struck at how each of you actually mentioned this idea for a need of continuity and durability across policy, a roadmap, a plan, some kind of vision. It's actually a subject I spent some work researching it myself. And one of the kind of solutions, I use the solution with some hesitance, because there's not really one solution, it's many things that are needed. But one of the tools is governmental agencies that are given a mandate to sort of implement things over a longer period of time. And Ofgem is one such entity, which is a regulatory body, is responsible for overseeing the power sector, and has some clear goals. So Neil, I wonder if you could help us understand both what is needed, from the energy perspective, from the transmission side, but also, as a regulator with this kind of long-term view, in theory, how do you put that into practice?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is important to note what a transformation is happening in the power sector. So power assets, power infrastructure is not on that map, because historically it's really been very geographically focused, very small. But as has already been mentioned, I mean, solar panels only 3%, but 3% is a lot more than what it would have been before. Wind farms onshore, or particularly offshore, can be very large in the area they cover, albeit coexisting with other land uses, and so that's quite an important point. But a lot of these new renewable assets are being built on the edge of the British energy system. So North Sea for the offshore wind, Scotland is where most of the onshore wind is best, and so you see our new generation assets at the edge of our system, but obviously the demand is in the middle of the system, particularly southern England, the Midlands, and the industrial north. So there is a disconnect, and that drives another sort of major bit of infrastructure build that's required, which is a massive increase in electricity transmission grid that's required. All those pylons up and down the country, there's going to have to be a lot more of those, and that is going to generate some political controversy. We've already seen the political controversy about onshore wind. We've seen it about solar panels to some extent. And there's going to be, already on the East Coast, we see coastal communities concerned about these new wind farm connections hitting their coastline, even though the actual footprint of the new assets is relatively small. So there's a real political issue to navigate here. So we can have long-term plans, and there is now an independent energy system operator evolved from the national grid, which will be setting out long-term plans for the energy sector. But they can't be, they have to take into account political realities, and we've seen issues around that. So on the one hand, the general public in this country remains really supportive of net zero. If you ask, and the government regularly asks the public about their opinions about energy assets, and more than 80% of the British public regularly say, yes, I think there should be more renewables. I think they're a good thing. If you ask them, should there be more renewables in your local area, it falls down to 45%-ish, although only 12% are against. So actually a lot of people are in the sort of don't know camp, or in the, well, you can't build a wind farm here anyway, so why else can be camp? But I think that does go to tell some of the challenges that are going to be going forwards. We have a political consensus, not just, we have political consensus now around building stuff fast. And the Windsor Review, Nick Windsor, a grandee from the energy sector, published a review for the government recently saying, we need all this new transmission cable capacity, and here's some ways in which it can get built faster. And there are important recommendations there for the planning system to enable, because often, roughly, it takes about 12 years from conception to actual completing a new transmission cable. We haven't got 12 years in order to connect these new assets, or have new assets built connected to nothing. So we need to accelerate that process. Of that 12 years, 2 years is the regulatory approval. We're going to compress that dramatically in Ofgem, so that we take almost no time at all, because it will be based on this strategic plan. Then 5 years is planning, sometimes a lot more, and 4 or 5 years for construction. So those two other elements of the process really need to be compressed. And I think that's one of the big challenges that is beyond the regulator. I'm glad to say we don't have to make these difficult political decisions. We are leaning in, we're making sure we're approving these new infrastructure projects fast. We have to check they're good value for money, both for the long run as well as the short run for consumers. But the tough decisions are to come, and thankfully politicians to make them.
Wonderful. I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition of the need for long-term vision, but also really immediate action and timeframes that actually challenge some of the existing policy processes, as Mark is also mentioning. Alex, welcome. Thank you for performing your public duty and TV. It's wonderful that you're able to join us. We've just been looking at the question of what's needed from the perspective of climate, of food, of nature, of energy. Curious what you would add to this list we've been going through on maybe particularly on the housing and people front. Yeah. What do we need to do to have good homes for people in this country as well, but also any kind of other reflections on these things?
So my basic view is the same as the House of Lords Commission on Land Use framework. Is there are basically 7 types of land, broad types of land use. You know, there's agriculture, there's nature, there is, and I'm going to forget one, there's energy, there is sort of development infrastructure, which includes housing. I've already been run out of the other 2 things are, but anyway, there are seven basic things, and we do live on a small island, particularly the English part of the island, that is already in many ways developed, and we are asking our land for a number of different things, and that's why I like very strongly believe that we should actually designate every acre of land in this country with its potential uses. And if we do that, then it'll unlock the uses of that land. We actually have a situation where we still have certain parts of the country which are still feudal in outlook. So the land is unregistered. There is no registration of it. It's not, you go to the land registry and you can find big black holes of land that ownership existed before the registration of land was required. You know, we have thousands of acres like that. That is no way to run one side with all of these different potential use of land and need for that land. And I think that everything else will then flow from it. So carbon sequestration, there's one of the things I forgot. So I think then things can flow. For instance, carbon market. We can't really have a useful carbon market in this country until we've done that piece of work, because how do we know where we can offset the carbon? We can't have a carbon market without offset, without sequestration. And how do we know usefully where that is best placed? So it's a bit like saying we're just going to have life free for all. We're not going to worry about it too much. We're going to let the current chaotic planning system deal with it. And even though it's good, you know, to have ambitions and to look at cutting the time that we need to have new energy projects connected to the grid, that is just a very small part. And we have all of these different interlocking bits of policy that don't quite work together. So we've got the current planning system, we've got the biodiversity net gain, we have all of the ELMS type systems which for farming. We have we've got a farm to fork strategy, we've got an environmental improvement plan. None of these things really sit together because we haven't got land use right.
So I think this idea of a roadmap and kind of clarifying where the current status is and what the key trade-offs and synergies are sounds very important. Also quite hard to do, but that's probably why it's useful and hard and important, because it is hard. But I wonder if we could drill down this question of these synergies, actually, because we talked a lot about trade-offs, and we could probably copy paste the UK's land area several times and then satisfy us, but we're not going to be able to do that. So are there places where we can get a win for one and the other? Some of you've already mentioned a few of those. And what are the kind of tools we have to unlock that? So, is it all zero-sum competition over finite supply? Chris, can I come back to you instead of
Yeah, so I think coming back to the point I made around what is low carbon, and then to take Alex's point around potentially where are future carbon markets going, the opportunity for the food and agricultural businesses of this country to embrace that, I think is an exciting one. And Manette's mentioned about the dairy industry and the efficiencies that it generates, and if we could then export that model to other countries to be able to take that up, we have an opportunity not just to reduce our own emissions in the UK, but to see the dial, the emissions curve bend far further. And the challenge we've got obviously with land use is not just in the UK as an island, but also future land use of a growing population, particularly in the global south. And we often say with housing, 80% of our existing homes will still be here in 2050. We'll have to reverse that principle. 80% of all homes will be new in the global south, and that will put enormous challenges on land and water use for the future. So actually, for the UK to pioneer approaches is a really important message, I think, that we can take away. And I think looking at the point that's been made around solar farms, how do we come up with a best practice approach that recognises there's biodiversity, there's potential grazing opportunities for sheep that I've seen going to Codrington Solar Farm in Wiltshire. There's sort of how do we make sure that these examples of best practice are normalised for the future, potentially rotational opportunities for panels to be removed. I think that at the moment, this either-or debate is a bit of a stale one. There will be innovation that happens, and we've got to be able to embrace that. I think I do come back to the political point, though, that it's incredibly difficult to resolve, which is around the use of meat. We can see that graph is not going away anytime soon. And when you look at that graph of beef versus chicken versus other meat, the beef challenge one is such a large one. And I will hold my hands up as a politician. I haven't really sort of gripped that myself. I don't know what the answer is. And we've seen in the States already, Governor of Alabama sort of saying, right, no, synthetic protein alternatives. Everyone has the freedom to be able to eat that meat. And that's what I think that we've got to be able to think through properly now, because there is obviously a challenge around land management and how to empower farmers to be able to produce low carbon meat, but then also how do we work towards the use of land that provides for also meat alternatives. And that's where there's got to be a better public engagement strategy, to the point that was made. It's one that I just see as being something that I shied away from the net zero review, so I feel slightly guilty that I haven't tackled it. So I'm here tonight to sort of think through what we go, because I think that there is opportunities also when we think around the methane use as well. The global methane pledge has gone from 30% to 75% for 2030. We can buy ourselves time, and globally there's a commitment to looking at methane or methane, as the Americans like to call it. So is there ways in which, again, the UK can lead on that from farm-based management practices, anaerobic digestion? I went to Northern Ireland, huge enthusiasm to grip this as an opportunity for Northern Ireland to sort of create a circular economy in terms of managing their agricultural waste and using the fuel out of that. But there's just not the policy support there at the moment. And the challenge, I think, is that yes, we are focusing on electrification as being a key part of the transition, but there are, at the edges of the transition, if we can reduce our emissions, as we did by getting off coal, going to gas, there are ways in which we can continue to reduce our emissions by looking at solutions that aren't necessarily the perfect ones, but are ways by which then the agricultural community can feel a part of the transition rather than being sort of forced upon them.
Yeah, I think that's indeed the vision to try to think how we build. And I'm really curious about your view on this, because there's farmers are the people who have most contact with most of the land in practice today, and there seems to be a lot of different competing objectives here. Where do you see some of the synergies, and there's some of the ideas that Chris has laid out about what a new meat system might look like, part of that synergy? Imagine, or where are the pain points?
Oh my goodness, where to start? I mean, 65% of that, and you see where beef and lamb pastures, you can't do anything else on it. 65% of the country grows grass, and beef and sheep, in broad terms, are eating it. And they're doing a really good job, because if they weren't eating it, it would be rotting and it would be providing a bigger problem. Now, we could get rid of the livestock and we could plant trees on a lot of it. But actually, if you look at the evidence that is out there, and probably one of the most interesting pieces of research right now is being conducted by the Wakehurst project at acute. It's a government-funded project. And they are doing the comparison between a grazed grassland and an ancient woodland. And it is showing that the value of the microphyza fungi in the grassland is actually delivering far greater benefits than the ancient woodland. Now, that is a different case with young trees that are growing, but with the ancient woodland, the grazed grassland is really showing the true value of the microphyza fungi. So we aren't even measuring the baseline of what we've got yet. So the very first thing that we should be doing now is measuring the baseline of what we got. Because you can forget any form of carbon market. If you don't know where you start this journey from, you have no idea where you're going to get to. And we have to get our own house in order with production before we start selling off carbon credits, which is already happening. We are selling off land for carbon credits with a market that doesn't exist. I mean, it does not exist, and it has to be a globally recognized market as well. So there are synergies and there are a lot of things, but I go back to the dairy cow. This is the time for the UK to lead, and we're doing a great job with antimicrobial resistance, which is probably a real blueprint of how we have led on lowering our use of antibiotics in our livestock, which is 53% lower than it was 25 years ago, and making sure that our human treatment is delivering what is needed, and people are finishing their courses of antibiotics. And the two things are essential if we are going to beat AMR. And it's a very similar challenge with climate change. This is a chance for the UK to be leading. And the meat argument is a complete anomaly. I mean, just do not go there for the time being, because it takes everybody's eye off of the ball. What is killing this nation is our thirst for highly processed food. That's what's doing the damage to us. If people actually were cooking from scratch and whole foods, then we would not have the problems that we did. It's highly processed food that is doing the big damage. And the meat argument is really neither here nor there, because we are in a better place. Now, that's not saying we should stop. We should keep striving and incentivizing this iterative journey to net zero. But we absolutely believe, with the scientists that we're working with the academics that we're working with, that we can get there maintaining the same number of livestock. Because if we lower production here, with these trade deals that we've got a lot more trade deals than we did have, we will just be importing it. So changing the human diet is a big thing. And I would say that the government absolutely has to focus on highly processed food first, which is killing everybody. You look at the latest report that came out on the cancer stats at the moment, 50% of all cancers caused by obesity. So there are huge problems to our health. And the other thing I'd sort of add in all of this is defining these markets. We must define what these new markets, these environmental markets, look like, because ESG through CSR, so corporate social responsibility, environmental sustainable, goals that sit within that. That is impacting on every single business, whether it is Tesco's, whether it is Lloyds Bank, NatWest Bank. Sustainability is the license to trade. So we've got to be able to measure these things. We've got to define these new markets, and this is a role for government. And it's a role, we focus all of our attention on politicians. This is a role for civil servants, for government scientists, who have a massive role to play in all of this. And, you know, I'm really optimistic about it for the UK to be leading a lot of these discussions, but leading by example, showing what we're doing. And, you know, the US is ploughing on with these markets and defining them. We really should be there. All our fund managers, our pensions, everything, you know, should be underpinned by credibility on the database. And just a bit of a pushback on the intensive agriculture. You know, I've had 2 days now with ecologists actually at Peppering Farm, which is owned by the Duke of Norfolk, and I was blown away by what is going on. And so much of the problem is that we haven't been gathering the data. You know, when you really start to gather the data of what is out there, you are finding, you know, this entomologist said, actually pollinators in the UK, we are in a really, really good place when you benchmark us against the rest of the world. Well, who knows that? People don't know that because we are not gathering good enough data. So measure the baseline, gather the data of what we've got, define these markets, get off meat for a bit, and focus on incentivizing the change that needs to happen.
So I hear some commonalities on the need for good measurement. Can't manage it without measuring it. Could you say a little bit on this idea on the energy side? So people are suggesting grazing around solar farms, grazing around wind farms, grazing around energy pylons. How does that sit with farmers? Is there a synergy there? I'm trying to find some synergies.
You can graze sheep in amongst solar farms. Not that many sheep, but you can graze them. I mean, you know, what farmers like about solar farms is you are index linked, locked in for over 20 years. That's very appealing to a farm business. Compared to producing food, if you're getting £1,200 a hectare for having a solar farm, that is much more appealing. You know what you're going to get, you know it's index linked, and you've got it for 20 years. What's not to like? I mean, that's why a lot of landowners want to put up solar farms, and there's only one winner effectively, and that's the landowner, because everybody else in the area hates it. So there are a lot of synergies, but if we're not going to measure the baseline, if we're not going to do it together, I'm part of a massive cooperative, the Environmental Farms Group, which is about developing and selling new trades to water companies, to building developers. BNG is legislated now, but that government has to act to bring that together. At the moment, you've got developers who are driving a false land market because they are buying land to do their BNG. Land abandonment is not BNG. Biodiversity net gain needs management and work and effort to deliver on it. You can't just buy a plot of land, which builders are doing, and just think, leave it alone, and that's my BNG done. That is not. And if we're not measuring it, BNG is about showing 10% improved value. And why can't we have that for food? Why can't we have the same equivalent for sustainable food production, whereby, you know, developers have to do it for sustainable food? You could have allotments within new developments. You could have glass houses in some areas where we're pulling out dirty water. We could have it totally sustainable with using heat pumps as well. We could really drive change at scale that brings everybody in this line together and is exciting. But we're not doing it.
Definitely a key role for policy as well. We'll come to momentarily, but nature, Andy, where are the synergies?
The synergies. Well, I mean, I would like to talk about some of the synergies. I mean, I think hopefully there's an agreement here from what Alex was saying that we really do need a land use framework in England. We need a spatial land use plan, because I think we can find synergies that make better use of the land that we have. And from our perspective at the Woodland Trust, one thing that we're very keen on promoting and working with farmers to do is to increase the uptake of agroforestry, which can bring biodiversity and climate benefits on farms while maintaining levels of food production. And in many cases, productive agroforestry also adds another crop in terms of nuts and fruits. You can see on the map where our orchards have disappeared to. There's hardly any left. And I think the food security index that came out yesterday suggested we're only growing, I think, something like 15% of the fruit we eat and 53% of the vegetables. So with pulses, I think there's lots of opportunities to do more with the farmland that we have. But I think key is, and certainly we're doing a lot in terms of promoting agroforestry, which brings so many benefits, including improving shade and shelter for livestock, as well as providing hedges and edges, providing shelter belts, windbreaks. It improves soil fertility and prevents runoff and soil erosion. So there's lots of kind of synergies that can be delivered through, this is just one example, through agroforestry. So I think we can see the 2% there. I think the CCC was recommending something like 10, there's a potential for 10% of agriculture to adopt agroforestry. But what's needed is really good advice, independent advice and support and incentives for farmers to adopt agroforestry. I mean, it's got to be sustainable for them to do it. And I think that's a really important aspect that's needed. And I mean, DEFRA has just recently announced an improvement in rates that they're going to pay for agroforestry. So we need to see how those play out. But just to pick one example of what I think is a synergy, I think we can do a lot more in terms of promoting agroforestry in this career.
Thank you, and it's helpful to hear. Mark, synergies. Where can we get some wins for nature, food, others from energy development?
Well, I was going to start by saying what we need to do here is, and this is I've learned in my 2 years working on Bartley West here, is ask the farmers. For a start, they're relentlessly optimistic. I've never met anyone so optimistic. Well, I guess you have to be when you're in a business which is regularly devastated by acts of God, but and grain prices and other things you can't control. However, synergies. Well, if you look at our site, so 1,400 hectares, of which 400 hectares will have no solar panels on it. Some is woodland, but it's basically it's mitigation or it's areas of archaeology. There's 45 hectares where we can't put panels because of archaeology. County archaeologist is absolutely over the moon. He's been dying to get stuck into these fields, but Blenheim wouldn't let him. Now he can, so he's going to be trial trenching quite soon. We found a Romano-Celtic villa that no one knew was there. He's even more excited about that, as are we. But on the synergies that people will probably be more interested in, we will have sheep on the whole site. So every field, every fenced-in field of panels will have sheep. It's not me doing that. And we will have, I've now got 5 separate community growing organisations who will be on 8 sites, on mostly in the central site, but some in the south. So one of them has been asking Blenheim for access to land for 5-6 years. They're going to be growing, we're going to have some food forests, and we're going to have 2 people who are simply going to be growing organic crops on fields that we've set aside because for visual impact reasons we can't have panels on it, and one is too close to Church Hanborough. So there are synergies there. We've got a new cycle track, we've got a new public right of way. There is a public right of way there's potentially an old track from Blaydon all the way across to Church Hanborough, which would require Blenheim's permission, but they've said if we want to do it, we can do it. It goes through an old railway tunnel that used to take from Blaydon Pits, which was a quarry. So there's all sorts of things that could be interesting, which obviously people will say, yeah, but we'd much just rather it was 1,400 hectares of agriculture. But what I would quite like to say to people is ask the farmers why they're doing this. I mean, Minette alluded to the financials, but particularly our 2 main landlords have received a lot of letters from locals saying, please, please, please don't do this. Blenheim's, some of them are slightly edgier than that, but the basic thing is don't do this to us. No one has said, why are you doing this? And no one has noticed that neither of our major farmer landlords is exiting farm. They're not giving us their whole farm. For example, our southern site, we've got 200 acres of a 400-acre farm called Denman's Farm. Now, I used to go and pick up the letters from the farmer's wife, and we'd go through them. They're all very polite, I hasten to add. But what she said to me was, nobody's asked us why we're doing this. She said, this is the first time this farm has been viable in 2 generations because of your payments. It's not good land. With your lease payments, we've been able to build a new grain store, so we can now trade grain. We're now employing our son. We couldn't afford to employ him before. And my husband, who's 76, will be able to do a few less hours on the tractor. So it's a good business decision to do what they're doing. I know that a lot of people will say, yes, but we still get to look at the panels. But there are very good reasons for doing that. This small family farm is now thriving as a result of this. So there are great benefits that come with what you cannot deny is the visual impact issue. But if we can get over that and get used to it, then I think it will be okay.
Thank you. I think this you haven't listed aesthetics in our title as one of the trade-offs that we're thinking about. Obviously, when people think about natural project excellence, that's often what their mind first goes to. So I'm very curious in the panel reflections on how best a policy process, how society should think about weighing these different considerations, because obviously aesthetics matter. They're not just about pretty for pretty's sake. There's something about culture and identity and your day-to-day life that there's things. So I'd be very curious about how we can explore it. It's sort of a mysterious black box in some ways. There's like some concrete things we can do to unpack it. For example, power cables. People don't like them, but we need them. So how do we? Are there any ways to synergize there?
So I will take it from the local to the global, because ultimately this isn't a trade-off between, in my case, energy assets and nature, because if we don't get these energy assets in the ground and we don't get to net zero, then nature suffers. And I think that message resonates, actually. That 80% plus of people who say, yes, we should build more renewables, the main reason they say that is because they recognize that helps tackle climate change. And I think getting that message across, certainly the younger generation, for me, when I see wind farms, I think that's fantastic. I think they add to the view, and it's a sort of mind shift because you can see the good that they're doing. And I recognize not everyone's in that space, but it's sort of, over time, getting that message through will be I think a powerful positive lever for the infrastructure we need to build.
And are there any other synergies with the grid infrastructure in particular that you're thinking about, or other parts of energy infrastructure where you can have a new train line or some other kind of wind that can come with it?
So you can run these things, but I mean the big transmission cables actually, they need a bit of clearance space for safety reasons. So you can't put stuff right next to them. So that's not such a win. But they did a competition recently to design a new pylon, the traditional one that's existed for decades. They're now running out a new design, and I think they missed a trick there, because in my head you could have got big friendly giant type things, and people would love to have those. Well, I certainly would, sort of stepping across the British countryside, but that wasn't chosen, that option.
To be considered.
Is that off-gen policy?
No, not at all.
Great. I'm keen to get to the question and answer session. So I wanted Alex to close off this sort of panel session, reflecting a bit on what you've heard so far, but also synergies. How, from a policy perspective, how could government put this together much more effectively? Because we have all these different things, different departments, different layers of governments. How does it actually come together?
I think we need to start with need, and what do we need? What do we need to achieve here? We need to achieve food security. We need to meet our goals around net zero. So we need to have carbon sequestration, climate adaptation, and we need people to have access to nature. I mean, just on that side about the pylons, last summer I was in France. They have a very different attitude to it in France, and we stayed off the massive de Chartreuse, possibly the most beautiful part of France. It's full of pylons. It's beautiful with pylons. Just need to slightly unfocus your eyes. You don't see the pylons at all. And obviously they've got a lot of nuclear, so it needs a lot of pylons because it's a lot of transmission, long distance transmission. So I mean, a couple of examples. We've got some projects where we're most at risk in the UK in terms of climate and flooding. Flooding's our big climate risk. So we've got projects which have produced wetlands with people getting access to nature, and then they put longhorn cattle, which I know is low intensity farming, and it's not commercial farming, but still it creates synergy, and it creates public amenity, and it creates climate adaptation, and it creates sequestration. So there are definitely synergies available if you start with what's the need and what's the use of the land. And what we need from a public policy point of view is two things. One, the thing that I already talked about in terms of land use framework planning system, and the other thing is the right incentives. So where something might not be able to meet it through market means, then we step in and we create the incentives and the subsidies. And that is the intention of ELMS, but not how it's been delivered. Probably me and Minette probably could agree about how poorly ELMS has been delivered. The intention was right, and the delivery was poor. Yeah, sorry, it's an environmental land management scheme, and it's could then go into the stewardship and all that, but I won't get into too much detail. But in essence, it's there to encourage landowners. I'm not just going to say farmers, landowners in the broader sense, to manage their land more environmentally and create subsidies to do that. And potential for the Labour Party is to reform ELMS to make sure that it's more user friendly, particularly by farmers, because that's been the thing. There's a lack of technical guidance, that technical support. The implementation has not been very good, and then there's aspects of ELMS which haven't been delivered yet. But that's all detail. But it sort of sits a little bit like this idea that farmers like solar farms, because it gives sustainable income over 20 years. So if a harvest fails 1 year, you're still getting your solar money. ELMS similarly would have the same effect. You've renatured some of your land, the payments coming. Whatever happens to the rest of the land, you're going to get that money. So it's about trying to create the space with land to ensure that people can have a livelihood on it, and it's sustainable, and it meets all those different needs.
Well, lots of important synergies have been identified, and I guess the question is how to unlock them. But we're going to unlock some synergy between audience and speakers now. So